All right, we're going to go ahead and get started.
That's no good.
And, all right. So my name is David Erickson. I'm at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. No relationship to the Erickson Institute, although I'm married to a pediatrician. I care a lot about early childhood interventions. And we're going to have a panel here talking about, just to give you a sense of the arc of the day, we had this panel in the morning that really talked about sort of an overview about what the circumstances were that we were sort of operating in terms of what were the challenges and opportunities. We had a second panel that really focused on sort of ideas that work, and these were sort of, you saw that these people making a real difference in their communities, innovating and piloting new approaches to problem solving, and this third panel is really intended to sort of think about how we can take what went on in that second panel, those ideas that work, and fund them and scale them up. So we don't want to see one quad city in Chicago, we want to see 50. Right? But in order to do that, we have to find the resources to pay for it, and that's really what this panel is going to focus on. We do, in the panel represented here, have different sorts of capital represented. So we have philanthropic capital represented here. We have community-oriented community development finance from Cdfi's, impact investing, Community Reinvestment Act or motivated banks and the capital markets. And then woven through all of this, of course, is sort of government financing in terms of subsidy, regulatory policies, et cetera. So we're going to jump into that in just 1 second. One thing I just wanted to mention, when early on when we started the book project, we had Ian Galloway, Ellen Seidman, and Nancy Andrews and I were having these conversations, and part of the motivation was this kind of, both this frustration we felt about what was happening. You heard Alan Berube, or Eeyore, this morning talking about the doubling of poverty between 1973 and today. One point he makes in his article in the book, in his chapter in the book, that he didn't mention was another statistic that I find even more disturbing, which is the number of people who live in deep poverty, that is at half the poverty rate or below, has doubled in that same period as well. And so, in fact, the rate has doubled, so the number is even bigger because of the increase overall. So what you have is a pretty depressing situation in that regard. But what we did in these early conversations was we were looking at these examples that were really working. And of course, Quad Cities was one of the examples we raised up in the book as being this really clever way of being place-based, comprehensive, and cross-sector in their interventions. And there's several other examples like that in the country. You can think about the Harlem Children's Zone, Neighborhood Centers, Inc. In Houston, the purpose-built communities in Atlanta. Very exciting examples of this type of intervention that's really having remarkable success. I mean, the elementary school in Atlanta, where the purpose-built communities are, went from being one of the last ranked schools in the Atlanta public school system. It's now the 4th highest ranked. So we've seen the examples in Harlem Children's Zone and others. These interventions are working, and it's very exciting. The problem with some of these interventions, they all have one thing, and this is a little overstated. Nancy's get mad at me. Luckily, I don't see her in the room, but it's a little overstated. But part of the things that are really also common to all of these interventions that work are that they're headed by a charismatic super genius who has a friend who's a billionaire. And that is not replicable, that is not scalable. So you saw the panel, the panel before this was the charismatic super geniuses. This is the billionaire panel. So this is where we're going to try to figure out how we unlock the money that's going to pay for those 50 more quad cities here in Chicago, and that's really what we're going to be focusing on today. So what I'm going to do is you have the biographies of all the panelists in your packet here, but I'm just going to go down the line here really quickly just to kind of introduce you to the folks on the panel. Then we're going to go to the first question. So first we have to my left, to your right, Anthony Bug-Levine. And Anthony has. It's really interesting. If you ever get a chance to go to Johannesburg, you should definitely go to the Apartheid Museum. You'll see if this, as you go through this experience, it gets more and more intense, and the violence is rising. And then you walk into this last room. It shows you the Constitution for the new state of South Africa, and it's one of the most beautiful political documents you'll ever see in your life. And Anthony worked for the ANC government in the 1990s, and one of the things that kind of motivated him to go into sort of community development finance and impact investing was here you had these beautiful political rights, but it was hard to actualize them in terms of, because these people didn't have economic rights or access to capital that really could actualize them. And so Anthony, and after a few stints with people at places like McKinsey and Rockefeller, is now heading the Nonprofit Finance Fund. And for those of you who are familiar with this sort of, I wouldn't say quite a rivalry, but there's this sort of this difference between impact investing and community development finance. Anthony really has written a definitive book on impact investing, an architect of it, now heading a Cdfi. I always call it the sort of Nixon to China moment. And so he sees both sides of this. Next, we have Elena Harkness. She's a program officer at the MacArthur Foundation. She's been working with Chicago Community Trust, which is the architect of so many of the really high-performing nonprofits here in Chicago. She is now with the MacArthur Foundation. I think one of the highest praises I've heard recently of the MacArthur Foundation was we had a meeting at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco where Mercedes Marquez was speaking, and she was saying all these innovative things they're doing in Los Angeles in terms of combining their housing department with their transportation, with health and other entities. And she said, yeah, and we did all of this without a MacArthur Foundation. So you were very fortunate to have, the MacArthur Foundation has been a leader in community development from the very beginning, and we're really fortunate to have them in our industry. Next, we have Sally Martiniak, and she has experience in, she's passionate about social justice change, and she's been able to sort of act on that both in the private sector, the public sector and government, and as a nonprofit. So she's really seen capital from all of these different sort of flavors, but she's always been driven by this idea of bringing meaning to money to kind of activate that social change. Next is Holly Olson. She's Executive Director of Neighborhood Finance Corporation. I should mention too, Sally is operating in Wisconsin. And Holly Olson, who's the Executive Director of Neighborhood Finance Corporation, another Cdfi, both of these are Cdfis, and community development financial institutions, for those of you who are not in our sector. And she has a background in sort of hard-headed, sort of as an accountant in some of these global accounting firms, and brings that sort of expertise and that tenacity to the work that she's doing in trying to revitalize low-income communities in Iowa. And we're very fortunate to have her here. And finally, we have Matt Ryline, who is with JP Morgan Chase. He's the leader of their New Markets program, and is really sort of the Jimmy Stewart model of bankers, where he really is super smart, problem solver, gets things done, and is really, we need more bankers like him, because he's really able to sort of see the social value of these sort of investments, but also package it in a way that gets it past his credit committee. So that's who we have represented on our panel. And the first question I'm going to put to them, and we're going to go this, there's a lot of people on the panel, so we're asking them to be very brief. We're going to try to get it out, the conversation out into the audience as quickly as we can. And when we do that, I ask you also to be brief in consideration of your fellow attendees, because we want to get as many ideas on the table as possible. So the first question I have to the panel, so we're just going to start with Anthony and go down the line, is for each of them to talk about one or two promising practices, policies, products that you see that would help us scale up the kind of investing that would make more of these ideas at work possible. And you don't have to, but if you want to, talk maybe about one or two barriers that's frustrating you from doing that. So Anthony, can you start?
That's great. Thanks for that introduction. It's the most personal introduction I've received, and very evocative to remind me of what was going on in South Africa and still is. I don't know if you know that Nelson Mandela has been on his deathbed the last few weeks, and it's something he said about 40 years ago this week. So take a look at that. You led me there.
Yeah, sure.
40 years ago, he said he was stood trial for treason, and he was about to be convicted and was facing a potential death penalty. And he said he gave a 56-second closing statement that you can now find online. It's incredibly moving. But one of the things he said in that was, he said, I've fought my whole life against racial domination. He said it's an idea that I hope to see in my own lifetime that we solve, but if necessary, it's an idea for which I'm willing to die. And when I think about the passion in a room like this and what we're here to do, I often ask ourselves, what are the ideas we'd be willing to die for? And I think it's a funny thing when you're on a panel about finance, but I think a lot of us bring that sort of passion to this work, and I don't have the conviction or the strength that Nelson Mandela has to say that I'd be willing to die for what we do. But I think in our work, we certainly find that while we're talking about finance in very abstract, theoretical ways, this really is about the passion and the work of making this community a better place. So that's my divergence, not the answer to your question. But to answer your question, what do we see that it's going to take? We publish every year a state of the sector survey that surveys the financial health of nonprofits around the country. This is the first year that half of the nonprofits reported they would not meet demand for services this year. More than half would not, nor do half anticipate being able to meet demand next year. And again, nothing new to the people in this room. I think we've heard all day about that abstract reality and how it lands in people's lives. What that means for us, and to answer your question on what is this going to take, we really believe that it's no longer good enough to use finance to enable organizations to be more efficient. It's not good enough just to get people loans in the short term that can help them deal with delayed government contracts. We really believe at the Nonprofit Finance Fund that our work as a community over the next decade and more is going to be about fundamentally adapting to a set of new realities. We think that increased demand for services, which is a result of some structural shifts in our economy we've heard a lot about and choices we've made politically that have led to inequality, is not going away. And we also think that government funding has retreated in a way that is permanent based on demographics and the state of the economy. And in that environment, we think that the most important work we're seeing is work that's enabling nonprofit service providers around the country to adapt to these new realities. And so for many years, we've been lending as a Cdfi, and we've also been providing advisory services. But we think that the real challenge among everyone in this room, and the people with capital, the people who need money to deliver services, is how do we fundamentally navigate the challenge of balancing the need to deliver services right now, when fewer than half the organizations have the money they need. People are turning away cold people on a winter's night because there aren't enough beds in the shelter. They're turning away hungry families with kids because they don't have enough food in the soup kitchen. This is happening all over the country. The need is so pressing. And yet, if we put all of our money into just trying to meet the need, we're still not going to be able to meet the need that's growing with shrinking resources. And so how do we balance the need to invest in adaptation against the need to deliver for communities that need our services right now? And to answer your question, the most exciting work we see is the work to answer that question in a way that's intelligent, open, that tries to remove some of the power dynamics between funders and grantees. And just two very concrete things we're doing. One is a real view we have increasingly around the country in our work that just lending isn't good enough, and that you have to couple lending with credit enhancements from government and from private foundations, and with real deep support to providers, whether that's in the form of advisory services, new ideas, management training, and it's putting those things together. If you just give people advice, they'll know what to do and they won't have the space to do it. And if you just give them loans, they might help bridge that contract with the city for 6 more months, but then they'll be in the same position a year from now. So one of the most exciting things we're seeing, and happy to talk about the way this is landing specifically in our work, is what we call complete capital. It's approaches where you're putting these all together in a very intentional way. And the second piece of work we're doing around the country is about supporting those organizations that can prove that what they do delivers outcomes and especially savings to taxpayers or others. And this is the whole Pay for Success and Social Impact Bond movement. And the speaker just spoke about the whole challenge of the juvenile justice system. And she talked so passionately about the insanity of a system that's actually costing us more to deliver outcomes that are worse for our fellow citizens. Anytime you see something crazy, the finance people get excited. Just be crazy, should be bankable. And so there's a lot of work being done to say, let's not just throw our hands up at things that are crazy, and let's say if something's costing more to get a worse outcome, well, as a finance person, I can figure out a way to finance that so we can spend less money to get something better. But to get that done, it's not good enough just to set up the markets. We're doing a lot of work around the country preparing nonprofit service providers to succeed in a world in which if you can prove that what you do saves money and delivers outcomes, you can get more resources.
Great.
So sorry for that.
No, that was super helpful. Thank you, Anthony. Elena.
Well, so first, thanks, David, for the introduction. I'm sure that's the only time in my life I'll ever be introduced as a billionaire, so I just sort of enjoyed it. I won't get used to it. That was great, though. I am very privileged to work for the legacy of a billionaire that had the sort of good foresight to want to invest in what works in neighborhoods and to really make the investment in continuing evaluation and research and sort of understanding the fundamentals of how neighborhood development works. And so I'm very grateful to work at the MacArthur Foundation for that reason, and with all of the very wonderful organizations in this room that are doing the hard work every day to make lives better in Chicago neighborhoods. When I think about some of the things that are promising in terms of getting to scale, MacArthur's been invested for more than 10 years in the idea that I think is at the core of this book, which is that you have to work across multiple domains in neighborhoods at the same time. So there's this idea that I think has become almost accepted wisdom now that integration is fundamental, sort of this idea of comprehensive is fundamental, and we have to work that way. Everybody here knows that working in even one domain, whether it's housing or employment, whatever your sort of specialty is incredibly hard. So doing it well across all these different areas at once in a place, I think we all know is incredibly difficult. So what we've learned is that there is a high value in investing in intermediaries that can do the important work of translating across all these different areas, brokering connections with people that have this sort of shared interest in a place. And so I think a key opportunity for us is going to be lifting up the value of intermediaries going forward, making sure it doesn't come across as sort of overhead, and making sure, most importantly, that these intermediaries are neither sort of swamped by the information that's now increasingly available, which I think is a huge resource. I would add that to the list of kind of the pillars of community development when we think about capital, human resources, physical capital. I think information is going to be essential, and making sure these intermediaries really have the ability to take all of that information and make it actionable. So I think there's the potential to sort of have information-starved nonprofits, but also to become swamped by this information. And so we've spent a lot of time thinking about what the right investments are in the kinds of key information brokers that can be helping people understand what's not only what works, but what's working on a more real-time basis. So I think to the extent that it's sort of a separate innovation or something that I think is a promising trend, I think funders of place-based work and funders of this incredibly complex, comprehensive place-based work especially need to be paying attention to building that capacity to use information wisely at the front end. It's not a back end, what happened, evaluation exercise only. And I think that's something we've really taken to heart at the foundation. We certainly do invest in the long-term evaluation and research to understand what did happen as a result of our investments in place and people. But it's that ongoing investment in upfront capacity for the nonprofits that are doing the work to actually understand how what they're doing is working in a more real-time way. And I think we've made some adjustments to the way that we're funding our projects in Chicago to sort of bring that more to the front end. So that's some of the things that I think about.
No, that's great. And Elaine, I hope we get a chance to get back to that intermediary. We touch on that in the book, and people have mentioned
Absolutely.
quarterbacks before
Yep.
in earlier conversations, but we'd love to get into that. And the data question is so important as well, so I hope we get a chance to talk about that too. Sally?
Thank you very much for allowing us to be here today, for the invitation. And I'd like to, in terms of what we do, we are the Chicago Community Loan Fund of Wisconsin, so to speak. And so we're also providing services to nonprofits across Wisconsin in all 72 counties. And one of the things that I used to think before is the fact that we make loans to nonprofits. And I've realized over the years that really that's not what we do. The lending is secondary to all of the advisory services that we do to make certain that we're shoring up those nonprofits so that they can be sustainable in the long term. And going back to Anthony's comment about the survey, we do a survey in Wisconsin. And one of the things that we discovered this year, very, very similar results, but the one thing that was especially scary is the fact that more than 25% of the respondents to the survey had less than 30 days of working capital available to them. And so that means that they have no room for error. They have no room for waiting for that next payment. So it really doesn't become that whole matter of, can we make them a working capital loan? It really is, can we do that? But what really is going to sustain them for the long term? So what I would like to see too in terms of those policy changes where we're taking our own direction is really looking at, right now what we do is that we do provide loans, but we've also shored up our advisory services. So do a lot of, we've just developed a 6-part financial workshop series That's a very intense series that we do have the nonprofits go through and so forth, because one of the other things that we've also learned is that it's not only a matter of time, but also capital. Even if it's $100 or $200, it keeps people from attending these classes. So it is something that we make certain that is funded so that they don't have to bear the cost of that, and that we're removing all of the barriers possible for them. But then we also do a lot of one-on-one work in terms of strategic planning and so forth. But we also last year merged with a granting organization, so that really what we're doing right now is taking the marriage of grants, financial resources, as well as advisory services, and I like to say that we envelop our nonprofits and we make certain that we can figure out what it is that they need to be taken care of in the long run. But the other thing that we're also looking at as a shift is really looking at how do we work more closely with communities and with the problems that communities have. So we're in the process right now of looking at having community conversations and developing then that mechanism of how we actually put our hands around an issue in a specific community, whether that's education, whether that's food, whether that is hunger. So really saying, okay, let's bring people together. And first of all, we all hear about why don't nonprofits collaborate together? Why don't people work across sectors? And if we stop and think about the fact is that we've not given them the tools to do that. We're really silo-oriented. Everyone has their own skill base. Everyone has their own, what they do best. And so really what we're trying to do is take the skills of collaboration, allow them to learn those tools, to really put their hands around that, and then to be able to really look at how the group together deals with that issue.
Great. Thank you, Sally. And Holly, we'll have you go next, and I don't want to influence what you talk to the group about, but can you, in whatever you say, also add the discussion we've had before about how the creative use you've done with local resources to sort of scale the work that you do there in Iowa.
Sure, yeah. Well, actually, I think the one thing when people talk about scale, I think it's really important to keep in mind that, to me anyway, scale is going to be relative to your area. $1 million in Des Moines, Iowa goes a lot further than $1 million in Chicago, okay? So, let's just kind of keep scale relative there in the first place. Neighborhood Finance was formed 23 years ago, and I've only been there for 11 years. So I will take no credit at all for how everything has been working, but it has been working, and we've made very little changes along the years. Now, that doesn't mean that we make some changes in terms of relationships with banks and secondary market and so on. But in a nutshell, we make loans to people who are buying homes. And our transaction is structured like a bicycle built for two, where the first rider is a loan that people borrow from us and repay to us. And the second rider on that tandem bike is the forgivable or free money that they get for their property improvements and on a purchase towards closing costs. Now, what's really key is that, first of all, that amortizing money is not loans to us. Those are commitments from banks or from Fannie Mae. Secondly, the forgivable money is not federal dollars. It is local taxpayer dollars from our city and county, and it's not federal money passed through them. It is totally non-federal. And so that has really created a lot of opportunities for us to try to meet local needs. Now, in terms of kind of cross disciplines and things like that, yes, I do agree, but I will tell you, as a state of Iowa licensed nonprofit mortgage bank, we have lots of regulations on all sides. We have what comes along with being examined by the state regulators and everything that you have to do regarding Dodd-Frank and NMLS and all the joys that come along with that. Then on the other hand, you also have the nonprofit and the 990 and gee, nonprofits are not supposed to make any money and and et cetera, et cetera. So, for example, 501Q, which is imposed by the IRS, tells lenders that you cannot do both a significant amount of lending and a significant amount of counseling. Or if you're doing a significant amount of both, then you could be subject to losing your tax-exempt status. So, while I think it'd be great, if we could have counselors, on the other hand, when the IRS is telling you about a certain regulation that you need to follow, that's going to take priority. So, now certainly, we work with other organizations and so on in town to make sure that community needs are met. So, it could, what's important is, are you meeting the needs of the community? it may not be that we are necessarily the only one who can do those particular programs. But we need to figure out, and so then we refer people to them, and so on, and it's been working quite well. So and the same with a different program that we used to have our agency or at our organization, and now another nonprofit has, and it dovetails so well with the service that they do. It was just really kind of the way to do it. So it is important for people to have a lot of relationships with your local community, and make sure that you're non-duplicative, because there's not enough money to go around, so you certainly cannot afford to duplicate. And then secondly, what is the best way to meet the needs of the community, and how can you kind of get people referred to the right spot? I could keep talking about this. So.
Thank you. Matt?
Great. So next time my mom asks me what I do, I'm just going to tell her to watch It's a Wonderful Life. Is that well, thanks. We talk about scale and policy. I mean, at JPMorgan Chase, everything we do in community development is really about scale. Right? We spend roughly $3 to $5 billion a year in direct community development investing across the country. And that's not to say our other economic development activities and small business lending and mortgage finance, but really focused on community development. So everything we do, in order to get that type of volume of money out, all we do think about is scale. So when Elena is talking about intermediaries, that is one of the primary manners in which we can see this industry continue to scale up, is by empowering intermediaries. And from our perspective, that means providing them with more financial capacity. So when I start to think about some of the policies out there or products, and I'll try to be optimistic here, the one that's sort of currently on the table is a Cdfi Bond program, which I didn't hear any groans.
You have your application ready for?
Application's ready to go in. But no, I think that's actually, I want to step back and think about that. That's right now sitting here, that's $1.5 billion of capital that can flow into CDFIs. Now there are a lot of hoops. Some of them are burning. Some of them are laced with acid. But there are things that to get there to do. But I think that it is a positive policy decision that this industry can come together and work around. The question is, can we get it done in 6 weeks? I'm not sure, but certainly in the future, it is a policy, and I think it's great to know that our policymakers, both in the legislature and in the executive branch, at least we're thinking about that. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to continue to force that thought. Similarly, along those lines, I'll continue to be optimistic when I talk about tax reform. Now, I'm not a soothsayer. I don't know if it's going to happen or not. I do know, however, there's going to be a conversation about our tax system over the next 12 to 24 months. And I'm worried about it, but I'll also take the optimistic view. When you think about some of the most successful community development programs that have existed in this country, a lot of them have been driven by the tax code. So the low-income housing tax credit, it's been around for about 30 years, is by all measures the primary way that the federal government supports affordable housing. And it's encouraged tens and tens of billions of dollars of private capital into that market through the tax code. Similarly, the New Markets Tax Credit, which I've been fortunate to work on the past decade, has provided $30 billion worth of capital into low-income communities supporting commercial and nonprofit enterprise. So when you think about the tax code, there's lots of downsides and upsides to that, but it's incumbent upon all of us in this room and within our institutions to make sure that the conversation is being had around how it can be shaped to further scale and increase the capital flowing into into community development lending and investing. And the last thing I'll say is, particularly from a bank perspective, and I know there's folks from the OCC here and probably the Fed, so I'm going to be careful and say that this is on behalf of Matt Ryline, private citizen, versus JPMorgan Chase. But some of it's just around clarity of rules and clarity of language of how we can invest, and in what instances we might be able to find exceptions to some of the regulations that the banks face in order to get access or provide access to more capital in low-income communities. And some of that's just simple definitions, and some of that could be done in verbal conversations. But I think a lot of it is just demystifying the acronyms and the regulations that we're existing in.
That's really helpful, Matt. Let's stick there for a second with these policies that we think can bring more capital. So you mentioned the tax code rewrite, the Cdfi Bond. Tony talked about the Affordable Care Act as being a potential new source of capital for the work that we're passionate about. And then Anthony, you talked about Pay for Success. There's quite a few of those embedded in the president's budget this year, and they were in last year as well, but we haven't had a budget for a while, so that's sort of making it sort of complicated. Can you panelists talk a little bit about anything else or expand on those that I just mentioned?
Well, I'll continue to talk. The Affordable Care Act, since you highlight that, I think that it brings up what people have been talking about here with comprehensive solutions. So we are in an era, I think, where I think we all agree that there's diminishing government resources to go into this space. And so where you used to have $1 for housing, and $1 for healthcare, and $1 for education, well, now you've got 80 cents for each of those. So you think about it in that stark contrast. Well, that's a 20% reduction in what you've got. But if you're creative and you work with government at all levels, how can you get those three to come together? So whereas you used to have think about 80 cents, all of a sudden you've got $2.40 to come together. And I think that's an important aspect about this. And so the Affordable Health Care Act, empowering federally qualified healthcare centers, giving them more resources through increased demand, it creates an opportunity for there to be investment capital come in there. And I think it's also an opportunity for impact investing and private foundations to see real multipliers of any investment that they make in that type of environment.
That's great. Thank you, Matt.
Can I say something controversial? I don't think money's our problem. And this sounds crazy when you can't meet payroll and the electrical utility wants to shut off the heat. But we have a lot of money. I mean, Matt's bank sits on $3 billion. Brandy's from Citibank. I don't know how much you guys are doing each year in investments, billions, I assume. The foundations, we have some foundation presidents here. Foundations sit on $600 billion in their endowments. They give away about $40 billion a year. We don't find in our work that there's a lack of people who have money. There's a lack of people who have money who are willing to take risks. And I think the biggest constraint we have to capitalizing the solutions that we're trying to put out into the marketplace to get the right kind of money into the hands of the right kind of people at the right time is the ability to match all that money with a ability for them to take the risks they need to take. So when we do, I mean, very specifically, we're setting up we have funds we're setting up around specific sectors to help, health clinics or human services providers. If we can structure it in a way that government comes in, helps provide loan guarantees, we have lots of people calling us up and saying, we'll take the super low risk, low return piece. It's getting the pieces put together that enables that to come in. So we find, at least in our work, sector after sector, geography after geography, if we can find ways to structure investments that allow very conservative, very risk-averse people to put their money to work, there's no ceiling on that. What stops us working is the other piece of it. It's the ability to find sources of money that are willing to take the risk that can make that other money flow eventually. And so, Obama's budget has a proposal for $300 million to support Pay for Success. But specifically and very smartly, what they have said is the federal government will serve as a loan guarantee to private investors who want to come in and fund some of these new programs, so that if they don't work, the risk will be low for the investors. And I think that's very smart. So we see around, we're doing work right now in New York City where we're talking to the mayor. And we're saying we don't need you to come in and provide a subsidy, because the whole reason why we need to intervene is because your budgets have been cut. It'd be silly for us to go back to the mayor and say, you cut the budget to social service agencies, why don't you put money into this financing vehicle? Just fund these guys directly. But because they've cut the budget for social services, they don't have that money. But a loan guarantee can allow that less money to bring in more money from the risk-averse people. So, I mean, I don't know about the other panelists disagree, but at least on a national level, it seems to me that money is not our problem. It's the right kind of money taking the right kind of risk.
So this is a great point. And one thing I do want to make a plug here for a collection of essays we have in the most recent issue of our journal, Community Development Investment Review. Ian Galloway was the editor of that issue, and it's all for Pay for Success vehicles and approaches, and Anthony and his organization have one of the articles in there. And I think this is really exciting, and I saw a lot of nodding heads here. So let's just go down the line. Elena, Sally, and then Holly.
No, I just want to quickly pick up. I think on a lot of these ideas about the risk and matching the sort of investment with risk. So the thing that concerns me, and I'm also very optimistic about the idea that Pay for Success is going to open up a lot of new investment potential, but we don't have great evaluations to show what the sort of hard outputs are for a lot of the more complex work that we do. And so I think that's just something to keep in mind. I do worry a little bit that there's going to be a flow of investment towards things that are able to show a more sort of simplified measure of return, and that does, for those of us that are doing work in the more sort of complicated, multivariate world of social service delivery, that is something that concerns me. I think we need to be investing a similar amount into the kind of rigorous and also qualitative evaluations that help us understand not only what's happening, but why it's happening, so that we're making the smart investments in process and the right kinds of organizations doing the work. That's just something that's important to pay attention to.
And I also agree in terms of that whole sense of being able to match the risk with the money. And really looking at that whole concept of, if it's Pay for Success, if it's social impact bonds, that whole sense of also being able to take venture capital-like money, and put that into the social problems that we're having right now too. Because I think that sometimes people are really, or at least I'm going to talk just about the nonprofit sector, is the fact that there's that tendency to really not take risk because of the fact that they're always so afraid of, we have to be right, we have to be right. But really now is the time to be bold, and now is the time to have that voice for your issue, if it's social services, if it's health care, whatever, because it really isn't, work is no longer the same as it once was, and our world is changing, and we have to be able to have those ideas that change with that world.
Yeah, I think regarding the availability of funds, I think it might depend on what it is. Like, for example, services is one thing. You can look to see, how are those best delivered and how are those paid. If I'm thinking that I'm going to make $20 million in loans this year, then I need $20 million of loans. But I expect to, be lending that for people to buy and all of that. So now, how neighborhood finance comes up with that $20 million, certainly, we can look at, okay, what is the way that makes it financially viable. And of course, you always want to have as low of cost of funds as possible. So I think, then I think you talk about risk. It may be that, there is a lot of money, but is Des Moines, Iowa, in, the market of somebody who has the purse strings. So I think that would be something that, that is kind of maybe part of the conversation as well.
That's great. Now, one of the themes that's coming out is this idea about capacity, infrastructure, intermediaries. We've all talked about that to some degree. And the folks at Living Cities have this terrible term called capital absorption. And even though I work for a bank or regulatory agency, my PhD is in history, and I oftentimes we get in these finance conversations, I get confused. And so Robin Hackey, who works there, is trying to explain to me. He says, well, think about it this way. Capital is like an airplane. And what they need, an airplane needs a landing strip in order to land, right? And so my question here is about the landing strip and the capacity with what we have to, and since we're in the home area of Donald Rumsfeld, I just want to ask this question about you go to war with the army you have, right? And so we have these certain set of institutions represented on the stage. We have foundations and CDFIs and CRA motivated banks. This is the main mechanism for getting capital out. Are those the right institutions? And can we work on capacity and tweak them and make them that landing strip that allows us to put more capital out? Or do we need new institutions? And I'm going to ask you guys to just go down the list here, starting with Anthony.
So I'm getting caught up in the metaphor, but so what I'm trying to, I think that's the wrong question to ask.
Okay.
I think we exist as financiers, we are a means, not an end, and we sometimes get confused. So if you come here and say, how do we land more money? I'd say that's not the point. The point is, how do we make our society a better place and deal with some of the issues we've been hearing about today? And so we find in our work that when we ask the question, where can we lend? We end up saying in this right now, well, the most creditworthy nonprofits are actually getting banked by the banks, and not by Matt's groups, but by his colleagues who just do small business banking. That wasn't the case when we started in 1980, but it is true now. And so on one hand, we lose a lot of the people we might be lending to are actually borrowing directly from the banks, which is better for them. The banks are cheaper, more efficient, turn it around quicker. On the other hand, the people who desperately need money can't borrow because they're in such desperate straits that actually financing isn't their problem. It's a more structural problem. And so when we ask the question, where can we land the money, we end up saying, well, not there, and not there, and not there, and let's find this little subsector in this little state. For some reason, we can do it. What's much more exciting in our work is when we don't ask the question, where can we land the money, but we ask the question, how can what we do contribute to a community getting sustained access to the services it needs? And that then flips the conversation, and we end up putting our work much more in service to these more comprehensive initiatives. And again, what we end up finding is that lending is important, so is helping an organization negotiate with the city government in a new way, or the state government, and putting that alongside other forms of support. So going back to your original question, what makes this hard? Well, we've heard about this. It's much harder to do that. It's much easier just to build a landing strip and land the money. It's much harder to build the whole system around it. And so what ends up thwarting us is that to do that means people who are not used to working together have to work together. The bankers have to sit down with the city governments in a new way. We've got to bring in grant funders to help support this system, and then they say, well, why are my grant funds being used to help some banker make money on a loan, and we have to overcome all that antagonism. But again, I just think that our most successful work has come when we've realized that it's not about finding ways to lend, it's about finding ways to put our lending in the service of actually solving the problem.
That's great, thank you. Elena?
I think those are great. I mean, I think it's a bigger question than we have time to answer in the context of a panel, but I have a few thoughts about how I think, given the fact that we have this society where we expect, I'm reflecting on the funding model, where we expect as foundations that we're going to take the high risk investment, we're going to invest in demonstrating something that works as a sort of solution to a social problem, and then the public sector is going to pick it up, or someone else is going to pick it up and provide for that. I think there is something fundamentally that we really need to question about that model because it isn't always happening. So I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch, and how we provide for the basic public goods that we need to function as a society. I'm not sure that it's always going to work by foundations taking the high risk and moving forward. I think one thing that foundations could always do better is be a little bit more in alignment about what kinds of high risk investments we're making and how we're learning jointly from those investments, so that we're getting a little bit something that approximates a little bit more of a even playing field of information to understand what's working. And then I think continuing to work on this cycle of innovating, delivering that to policymakers that are actually paying attention at a time when they can make hopefully convince their constituencies that something is worth funding. I think we all need to be paying close attention to that. Invest, get it to policymakers, fund the research, fund the evaluation, so we're demonstrating what works and how. But I do think we do have to question how we provide for basic public goods in this country.
No, I like that point too. I mean, there's I think the supportive housing people have kind of achieved that, right?
Yes.
They it's no longer a partisan issue. Everyone sees this as just good governance, right?
That's right.
It's cheaper, it's
That's
better,
right.
it's more humane.
Right.
Yeah, Sally?
I do want to ditto everything that Antony said, but I also want to add one thing. You had talked about, I think you had said something too in terms of the sources of capital and, do we need to create new institutions? And I don't think we do. But one of the things that we've been seeing, at least in our smaller state of Wisconsin, is the fact that we're seeing more individual investors come in. And really it's that sort of mid to high worth individual, and really looking at how can they put their money to work becoming part of the solution. So they really do want to see if it's that $50,000, $1,000, $100,000, how can they really see that money be invested back into the community? So I think really looking at the fact that people do want to be part of the solution also. And so it's not just coming from the larger institutions, but really looking at how we also integrate people.
That's really helpful.
Solution.
Thanks, Sally.
Yeah, you asked if new institutions are needed. I would not necessarily think so. I think, as been talked about earlier, it's enough for existing strong nonprofits and other organizations that do work in communities to maintain their level of service, or figure out what needs to be done differently and still remain financially viable. So I'm sure it could be done, but I would think this would be a really tough time to start a new nonprofit. So I don't know that I would necessarily recommend that. But I think probably what needs to happen is for people to try to determine where is there an unmet need, and then for groups to talk about how is that being done. And some of this may involve, this is thinking on a much broader schedule, and I'm not saying this to pick on banks. I came from a for-profit world before. Okay, I came from a for-profit world before I came to neighborhood finance, and part of it may be something as large as kind of readjusting shareholder and regulator expectations. I mean, it's like, okay, I tell banks, investing in our loans, this is not going to be to starve your portfolio. Rather, it's going to be like a refrigerator. You plug it in, it runs, and you get something. And so every month you get a check, and you get a little bit of return. Not a great return, but you can see in your community, what is going on and how things are getting better. If regulators come in and maybe there's a bank that's having some difficulty, instead of saying, hey, you've got to shed this low-performing community investment, realize that in the greater good of the overall community, hopefully it is doing something, provided that investment is performing as expected. It's not going to be a double-digit rate of return. I mean, yes, as personal investors, we all want to see a double-digit rate of return. Who doesn't want that on their own 401k, all right? Borrowers would love to have a 0% loan. I mean, who wants to pay interest, okay? So, those of us that are in this field, we are walking that fine line between, the two various customer groups, and, we don't have a great marketing and product development department, so it is a challenge. So, but I don't think creating something new is the way.
That's really helpful. Matt?
Yeah, I'm not sure that new institutions are necessary either, but I'll go back to what Anthony was saying. And I think there's probably enough capital out there as well. But I think it is about structuring the capital stack and asking the right type of institution to do the thing that is most consistent with what they can do.
Can you explain what you mean by capital stack, just in case we have some help people in the room and education people and others?
So it's about risk. You can think about your own portfolio that you maybe, in some instances, you want to take very low risk. You want to buy fixed income. You want to buy U.S. Treasury bonds, and very, very low risk, very, very, very low return. And then the other end of the spectrum, you may be willing to take a lot of risk, venture capital, startup businesses, and then everything in between. You have the stock market, you've got corporate bonds and high yield bonds. So when I think about when you think about trying to scale something up, you need to have a spectrum of that capital. You're going to need to have people that are willing to take very high risk to prove out a concept at the initial phase, and then you're going to need somebody at the other end that's willing to take larger amounts of capital and scale that proven concept up. And you need people stepping it up in between. And this is, I think, what Elena was talking about. That system doesn't always work. It is not an efficient market in community development, in the community development space. And so what I would say is you need institutions to be more overlapping. Maybe you need to have more collaboration from the start of a concept, where you have buy-in from the organization, the institution that's going to scale it up if it proves out, but they need to be committed at the outset with triggers along the way to determine when they're going to put their money in based on what successes are achieved. But I don't think that incremental institutions, more bureaucracy is not going to solve our problem. I think increased collaboration amongst the existing institutions is necessary.
That's great, thank you. We in preparation for this panel, talked a little about data and measurement. That's certainly come up several times. I don't want to take any more time to ask questions because I want to open this up to the audience, but I'm hoping we might touch on that at some point. So the Federal Reserve staff is they're coming around with microphones, so if you can just go ahead and raise your hands, you can get their attention. They're in the back. And then when you get the microphone, if you can just tell us who you are, your affiliation, and ask a brief question or make a brief comment, and we'll try to be as brief as we can be here in response. So why don't we start up here in the front?
Again, I'm Gilda Perella from Loyola University. I wonder, we're talking about innovation and interventions, and I'd like to know if the panel knows about hotspotting. If you don't, if I could be permitted a minute to explain.
You've got a minute.
I wish that the people who are here from the county talking about health and the criminal justice system were still here, because the example actually has to do with a Camden, New Jersey doctor who focused in on the 5% of the population that was using about 80% of the resources. And he discovered, by going house to house to the 5% of the patients that were overusing the system, that it was not through any problem of their own that they could solve. For instance, there was one person who had diabetes, but also had a blindness issue, which is typical can be typical of diabetes patients. The person could not inject the needed insulin. So on a fairly regular basis, almost every week, the person would go to the emergency room. And this continued in these 5% of the population. So actually, the intervention is, and the innovation is, to look at this hotspot of concentration of resources and to figure out what is actually going on there and to try to tailor some particular responsive resources or redirection of resources to that particular issue. And perhaps that particular example could be tailored to the things that everybody may be doing in this audience.
Great. Do you guys want to just focusing on high users, and I don't know if we talk about 80-20 rule or things like that. Does anybody want to take a stab at that?
Sure. I mean, I think this is part of what I said at the beginning, which is we as a system have to adapt. So we can't sustain a system in which we're spending that much money on not only a few people in the system, but also on a set of costs that we could reduce were we to intervene at different times. So we have someone we work with in New York who's done something similar around, if you look into housing projects, it's not just certain, data measurement now allows us to use GIS data to figure out where at a county or census tract level are most of the resources going. And now you can actually get within, not just on the census tract, she actually goes building by building and talks to people and says, which are the families in this building that are sort of making trouble? I mean, it sounds very judgmental, but people know in those buildings. And then again, you don't go in a judgmental way and say, well, how do we incarcerate everyone? It's what is happening in that family dynamic that can allow us to intervene because the state has failed to do so. What you're talking about is basic outreach, home health care, social work, things the state should be doing, but it's not. And then to get back to finance, can we figure out how to pay for those services because they save the taxpayer so much more than they cost to deliver? And I think that's the key insight there. And so finance absolutely has a role to play in supporting our system to adapt from one that doesn't treat or work with these people or works when it's a much more expensive time to do so. So we see lots of opportunities to use finance, which is what we know how to do, to get money into the hands of organizations that can take these kinds of solutions, scale them up, as long as we can link them directly to the kinds of savings we get, which is ultimately what's going to, there'll be political momentum around savings. There's not going to be political momentum, unfortunately, around increasing the dignity with which people can live in their homes.
Great. Calvin, we got you in the back.
Sure. Thanks, David. So I'll try to make it two quick questions if I could. So for the panelists who are underwriters either through debt investing or equity investing, as well as the foundation investors, I'm just trying to gauge how much we are all able to sort of walk the walk, right? So the book talks a lot about cross-sectoral strategy, interdisciplinary strategies, comprehensive development. Oftentimes, there are situations where the only actor in a local community that has a higher level of capacity might need to step into a new business line to get at some of these comprehensive development opportunities. How do you underwrite the new business model that they're attempting, and how do you empower them to be successful? That's one question. And then the other question is for Elena, coming through the New Communities Program experience, and harkening back to David and Ian's encouragement that communities have quarterbacks, which I do think can be a great idea, but I think we would all agree here in Chicago that there was some discomfort at the community level about how lead agencies were determined for new communities. So Elena, if you could speak to what the foundation has learned from that process of setting up lead agencies, and if you could do things differently, how you might do so going forward.
Sure. So should I start?
Sure.
So I'll start with your second question. Well, you all heard from Bernita Johnson-Gabriel from Quad Communities Development Corporation. So Quad Communities is a great example of both an organization that sort of didn't exist before the New Communities program and came into existence largely because there was a need for a kind of expertise that didn't exist in that neighborhood at the time, which was bundling, doing the kind of comprehensive but commercial focused development that would help these mixed income community and corridors thrive. So what I would say about how the foundation dealt with the politics of this and sort of picking and choosing the intermediaries is that we worked and we relied on another intermediary. So we have this sort of layer of expertise, which I think, I will be very candid, that's a very important, there's a very important sort of playing out of organizing at different levels, right? And I don't think the foundation would have been at all effective had we gotten in the middle of what was happening in the Quad Communities discussion or what was happening over in Logan Square. We have always, I think it's been productive for us to maintain a couple of degrees of separation from that. And so I would give all due credit to our main grantee, which was the Local Initiative Support Corporation, which did an expert job of handling the dynamics of sort of, the local community organizers, many different organizations in that neighborhood that were sort of all vying for the sort of role. And they set objective criteria for how a lead agency would be chosen. And they stuck by those criteria across all of the neighborhoods where they worked. And so I think we all felt comfortable that there was a shared sort of understanding about what values were important in an intermediary, what we would be looking for in terms of financial stability and technical capacity and leadership, funding, all of those things. And then we really let them sort of take those objective criteria and make the decisions based on. Did that answer your question?
It did, thank you.
And who wants to tackle
the other question?
And just in terms of the first question, do we walk the walk, so to speak, in terms of funding new initiatives? And the answer is we do. But what we like to look at is, so the basic, what is the business plan, how are you going to pay us back, and so forth. But even going back to my commercial lending days, is it's not just about the business plan. It's really about how do you really make this work after the loan is done. So we have at least quarterly meetings with anyone who has a new initiative so that we can make certain that they know that we are there to support them throughout every phase of their growth. Because it really is, if you're going to grow, and it's typically in that first year to 18 months that something's going to happen, that you sort of, fail a little. I think Kim had mentioned it at first, it's the fact that you have to be there with patient capital and willing to also structure it in a way that allows the new initiative to succeed. So it really is, it's a matter of helping them on the front end, but really more important, being there after the loan is made.
I have a question for Matt. Hi, I'm Dory Rand from Woodstock Institute and Chase's longtime partner, so I appreciate that. Matt, you mentioned that you needed some more clarity in the regulations or the definitions or exceptions, and I wanted to ask you to fill in a little more detail about that. And I also wanted to mention
the one question that I didn't want to talk about.
Sorry. You can answer as Matt instead of as Chase if you need to. But, recently the federal banking regulators revised the Community Reinvestment Act Q&As, I think to provide some more clarity and some more incentives for community investment. But they didn't go the next step that I think most of us in the room have been waiting for 3 years, which is to go ahead and do the new CRA rules, particularly around things like assessment area definitions, which, if changed and modernized, I think would provide a lot more opportunities for investment in areas where banks do a lot of business but may not have a bricks and mortar branch or headquarters. So would you agree, as Matt or as Chase, that it's high time for that? Thank you.
So everything I will say here is as a private citizen, not an employee of JP Morgan Chase, although obviously informed by my work there. So I would agree, on CRA, I'm going to quickly get out of my depth about the nuances of the regulation. However, on the geographic side of it, I think that there's a general consensus amongst the entire industry that the old geographic focus around where you take it. So for folks that don't know about Community Reinvestment Act, it's a very well-intentioned regulation that says wherever your banks are doing business and taking deposits, you need to also lend and invest, which makes a lot of sense. The issue is, in this era of very large banks, we have huge concentrations of deposits in 5 or 6 cities and we all do, New York, Houston, Los Angeles, Chicago. And so it becomes virtually impossible for the banks to achieve CRA level investing at where they should in all of those markets. Whereas we then tend to not focus as much on more rural communities or smaller cities where we don't have as much deposit. So I think that there's a broad consensus, and I think that our public comments would echo this, that there should be a change in focus in geography away just from the big cities, which are based purely on our deposit base. On the other comments, it was really more focused on not so much on CRA, but actually allowing us to do things a little bit cleaner. And maybe I'll steer it back to some of the stuff that I'm a little bit more comfortable talking about. I deal with tax credit programs and government subsidies. And it's incredibly cumbersome to close those transactions. Anyone that's closed a New Markets tax credit transaction will know that the lawyers and accountants are the ones that get the most benefit out of that transaction. And so if we were to get guidance from, say, the IRS, the Cdfi Fund, indicating certain things that our attorneys are interpreting because of the broad context in which the Internal Revenue Code operates, impacts this very narrow, well-intentioned community benefit, we would be able to do things a lot quicker, a lot cheaper, and provide a lot more subsidy at the bottom. So I think it's those types of clarities that I'm really focused on.
Great, thanks, Matt. I think we have time for one more question before we're going to do a conclusion comment from each of the panelists, and I think the gentleman over here has the microphone.
Yeah. My name's Doug Judy. I'm a UC Berkeley professor, and but more importantly for here, I'm working on developing a new Center for Community Development and Health. And I had the interesting experience last week of attending the Clinton Global Initiative, and one of the working groups, or the working group I was on there, was focused on community investing. And one of the things that we were able to sort of agree on, at least a subset of us, was the importance of place-based work efforts and integrated efforts. So the things be brought together, that the schools, the clinics, the daycare centers, the grocery stores, the banking facilities, all be in a similar co-located location, and they be integrated in some way. And what we struggled with, though, because currently from colleagues of mine, CDFIs, they generally avoid, frankly, working with intersectoral projects because the funding gets so complicated, it's just not worth the extra effort. So my question is, what are the things that can be done, or what's needed to make those sort of more complicated efforts? One of the questions that came up was, in the end, someone owns the buildings, and someone has to pay the rent. And how do we finance what generally we believe is the best way to go?
It's interesting. We had the book launch in Washington, D.C., and thanks to Nancy Andrews' amazing contacts, we had 3 secretaries contribute this one chapter about how you could do that at the government level. And the secretaries, I'm sure, were involved, but you know how these things work. They had more junior staff writing it, and so you had them on stage, and they, the comment that just resonates with me along these lines was they just said, look, the weight of the world reinforces silos, and there's no way currently to solve the wrong pocket problem, and so this is a really key question. So we know what works. We know we have to do these types of cross-sector, place-based, comprehensive interventions. Once in a while, we get a breakthrough like a Quad Cities, but how are we going to get more of those?
I think one thing that we ran into is we were approached by someone who wanted to do not quite as much as what you described, but on this kind of smaller scale with a few different services in one building. And I think what ended up happening is I'm like, okay, we're a lender, so we're going to need these things, these documents, and so on. And those never really were sent to us. I think that folks were thinking that because we were this nonprofit that we could just have a conversation and then lend $1 million. And so so like we never got into no doc loans, okay? And so that wasn't for us. And I think they ended up getting something somewhere from someone who was and that or other organization was able to offer some technical expertise to say, okay, let's talk about this, in this, and what we mean here is this, and so on. And so in the end, the job got done, and the facility is open, and they're doing well, and so on. But I think some of this might involve maybe kind of educating the potential borrower as well, and maybe helping them work on their skills.
I was going to say, we financed actually several projects, but there was one, it was in rural Wisconsin, and it was a cap agency that had purchased a building that was going to house several other services within the building, so a Planned Parenthood center, there was a workforce development center and so forth, and also a free clinic. And what happened really was the fact that we were able to fund it because of the fact that it was the cap agency that was taking the initiative to put all of the partners together. And subsequently, actually, what's happened is that they now have an FQHC in the property, and they also have, the free clinic has expanded, and they also have several other services, but it's all under the domain of the cap agency. So I almost wondered too, and then looking at the larger cities where I think you do have more of that tendency of silos existing, is that, sometimes, I don't mean to just generalize, but, are projects like this easier to undertake, in a rural community where it is that one larger nonprofit that really does rule. And, and maybe what we have to do is take some of what we learned there and then bring it into the metropolitan communities.
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, the weight of the world reinforces silos because there's so much value in specialization, right? In an organizational specialization and sort of specialization of expertise. And so, I think a lot of the key, and that's why this intermediary theme keeps coming up, is intermediaries are specialists at being generalists or network weavers or whatever term you want to use, but they're specialists at creating those connections and being the sort of master narrative holders, of that this is actually a higher value way of doing business than if we were all going it alone. So I think, it's continuing to make the case that, and trying to build more evidence that actually that way of working is more effective, and then continuing to invest in the people whose job it is to be that generalist or that special.
So on a tactical level, I would agree with you entirely, but on a tactical level, there are ways to do this, and it comes down to getting in front of the government agencies, theoretically, where the streams of capital are coming from, in many instances, the reimbursements, who may sort of initially preclude them from working together, but sitting down and explaining the benefit that they're all going to achieve by combining them. And it actually works, surprisingly enough. You either go to a state capitol or you go to Washington, D.C., and you sit down with the administrator of these programs, and the scheduling becomes the most difficult part of that. If you can get the 2 or 3 people from the different agencies in the room and sort of just walk through and explain with the, from our perspective, with the client, why this is going to benefit them and why it's going to achieve more of the objectives of each of the agencies by combining. So, we've had some great success in working, for example, with SBA and with HHS to figure out how to combine certain programs.
Well, I want to thank the audience for all those great questions, and we're just going to go about maybe 5 or 10 minutes over here, as my colleagues from the Chicago Fed have given us license to do. So what I'd like to do is just have some quick closing remarks from the panel. 1 to 2 minute conclusions on this conversation, and we're going before we transition to the next stage. So, Anthony, you want to start?
Sure. I often find that we misunderstand the nature of finance. So we're investors. Any investment that works, by definition, takes more money out of an organization than it puts in. So I say that, and investors get upset. Well, no, we make a difference. Yes, we make a huge difference. But if you run an agency or you run a nonprofit and you're struggling under budget cuts, and you look to the people in this panel and say, well, you guys are investors or the community finance industry, you have all this money, you can solve our budget problems. We can't. Because anytime we invest, we get paid back, and when we get paid back with interest. We're going to take more money out than we put in. So we don't pay for social solutions. We finance social solutions. And I think making that distinction is really important. What can you expect from the community finance industry? We can be the capital that enables you to adapt and to generate a new business model and a way of working that ultimately is going to tap into revenue streams much more than you're currently doing. And that's why we can finance social good. We can finance your organization. Taking money from us can end up being an incredibly powerful way to support your community and expand your work, but we don't pay for social good. We finance it. And so when you look at ultimately what does pay for social good, there's only 4 sources that I can think of. You can get your customers to actually pay you, so you can charge someone to come to your homeless shelter. There's moral and practical limits to that solution. Government is in the business of paying for social good, but that's shrinking. The 2 other things you can do is you can go to private donors. They can't fill the gap left behind by government, and they're increasingly frustrated by being asked to do so in unrealistic ways. And the last thing you can do, and we heard about this earlier today, you can work with corporations. You can become a supply chain partner, so run a jobs training program, charge the companies you're placing your people at. Those are the only 4 ways I can think of. So I just want to end by saying, ask us to do what we can do. We can finance your capacity to adapt and build the ability to tap into one of those 4 revenue streams. But at the end of the day, if we as a society are not committed to paying for social services, there's no free lunch on this stage. And I think there's no free lunch within the community finance movement or industry. You know, the fuel for all this ultimately comes back to a commitment we have to make as a society that we are not willing to cut things further than we already have.
Thanks, Anthony. Elena?
I guess I want to end on an optimistic note, which is it has never been less expensive or more important to get high value information, and it's only going to get cheaper. And I think as we're all struggling with how to do more with less, making those investment decisions to sort of invest up front in better sources of information and smarter people to make use of it, I think is going to be a way that we're really able to do a lot more. So this, getting back to your wonderful question about the sort of hotspots and heat maps, I'm so encouraged by what I see more and more governments doing, and this gets to the idea of sort of looking at things in a more comprehensive way, where they're breaking down their information silos, and they're looking across all of their public information as an asset, and trying to understand new ways, uncovering new patterns that help them make better investment decisions with our taxpayer dollars. So I think as a foundation, we're committed to doing that, supporting that same kind of work, both for the public sector and private investment. So I'm just encouraged by that.
Great, thank you. Sally?
Also end on a private or on a personal note here, but on an upbeat note, is the fact that I do think, I first of all think that I have one of the best jobs in the world, because the fact that I work with remarkable people every day who are doing remarkable things, whether it's in the private sector, the public sector, or government. And so really looking at the people on this stage, the people across this room and so forth, I think everyone really does want to find a way to do things better, differently in the years ahead. And so I think it's just a matter of really connecting the dots and finding and being open to different ways to do things, and to understand that they may not always succeed that first time around. And to know that every time you fail, you're also learning something. And what is it that we're taking away from that? And how can we build it better the next time?
Great, thank you. Holly?
Realizing that we're an hour and a half past lunch and we've run a little bit over, I'll just be brief and to succinct here and impractical. Really kind of, I guess, community development and what all of us do is kind of like, many other aspects, you can think of. Number one, you can never have too many friends. And number two, you can never have too much money. Now, and we need money, okay? But, I guess the thing there is that, you always want to make sure that you're continuing to, build your advocates, and never think, okay, we've crossed that hurdle, because the time to worry is when you become complacent. And so, always keep looking for different areas of funding. I'm not talking about mission creep. Never take on money just for money's sake, because it's going to have you do something that's so odd and different that you may be setting yourself up for failure. But on the other hand, you do want to think of, are you taking on a risk that would be for the good of the community? But really, always keep looking for, more supporters out there, people who can bring to you good ideas that maybe can, help you out or can help out your community. But also then, in terms of, the always looking for money, we just finished asking banks in our area for funding of our amortizing loans, and we do that periodically. It's through an SEC private placement offering, and our system can handle 12 banks. We got our 12th bank commit on Friday. Of the 12 banks that have committed, 35% of the money of that offering is coming from new banks who are investing in us now for the first time in the 23 years that we've been around. And, kind of some banks come in and out of the market and so on. So I would just say always keep looking for more friends and more money, and never become complacent, and don't be too comfortable in your silo.
Thank you, Holly.
I'll just finish by saying that as a banker, we measure as risk, and in reality, the investments and loans we've made in CDFIs over the past 25 years have proven to be extremely low risk, but high impact, right? So, and that's something that I think we should all just bear in mind, and something that all the CDFIs should be very proud of. They're incredible stewards of private and taxpayer money. And so I guess do I get the last word? I'd say love your local CDFI. That would be
Good hair.